the best deep diving crankbait of all time. Well, is it? Who knows? Who knows? That's the debate here today. What is the best deep diving crankbait of all times? I've got a handful of choices here, and we're going to talk about a couple others, but the best deep diving crankbait of all times. Now, there's a bunch of different options. We could go back. We'll talk a little bit about the history. You know, I think that, you know, one of the first ones, you know, was the, you know, mud bug, and that's not the original deep diving crankbaits, in my opinion. Those are crankbaits that went deeper, some kind of crankbaits, but really one of the first ones that kind of put it on the map for me was the Pose 400. Okay, Bagley's DKB, you know, not DKB1, that's a little river bait, but the Bagley's crankbait and this were about out at the same time. I think the Bagley's was out before, and then people were drilling it out. People, as in David Fritz and you know, some of those kind of guys, they were drilling out baits, and then Pose came along and really kind of did an improved version, the Pose 400 of that. This has caught a ton. I've caught a ton of bass on the Pose 400. I think it deserves honorable mention. Definitely not my best deep diving crankbait of all time. So then that came along, and then if you couldn't see the similarities, Fritz helped Rapala years ago develop the DT series. This is a DT16. It's the closest one. It actually runs a touch deeper than the Pose 400, but you can see the body's shaped a little bit differently. It's got a little different. It's got a glass rattle in it, and you know, bill shape and everything is very, very similar. But he just really dialed in the DT16. Now there's a DT14, which I know he was instrumental in, and DT20. DT20 is a good deep diving crankbait. DT16, very good. But Fritz himself, David says the 14 is the best running one in the lineup. He really likes the 20, and he said the 14 is probably the best running deep diver in that lineup, for whatever that's worth. But that's a DT. That's kind of a jump, but they're definitely correlated because you know, Fritz caught 1 million bass. Maybe 1.3 million, I think is the final tally on the Pose 400, and then now he's done that. Now he's on to the dredgers in the Berkeley, but that's too new. It's too new, not established enough, not enough fish catches on that. So I can't mention that just yet. But here is another honorable mention, and this is the fat-free shad, the Bomber fat-free shad. I caught a ton of fish on this coming up. You know, these were kind of my two go-tos early on in my career for deep diving crankling, because this one would run about 14 feet or so, and then this one would get a little bit deeper, about 16 or 17 on a normal cast. The suspending one would get a little bit deeper, but those were the two ones that I used quite a bit, and I loved them, and I caught a ton of bass on them. Neither one of these come through brush really, really good. They're okay coming through brush. But then another crankbait that we've got to mention in this category before we really start debating this is the Lure Jensen Hot Lips Express. This, yes, is a mother to crank. It is very hard. You can see how big that bill is. But the designer, oh, his name escapes me at the moment, of this bait. I've talked to him back in the day when I was sponsored by Lure Jensen. He you know, we had a number of conversations. We talked about how he developed this, but you know, for the body size and the bill shape, it gets down there. You know, this was one of the first crankbaits that I know of that got deeper than 20 feet in a consistent basis. Now, yes, there's the Man's 20 plus. Man's 20 plus. I didn't bring one out here because, in my opinion, it has not stood the test of time. It was good for a period. You had to, a lot of guys were shaving the bills. You had to modify them pretty heavily. They were also a mother to crank. They were very hard to crank. I think they were a little bit ahead of their time. But the Man's 20 plus and the Man's 30 plus even, the 30 plus was a booger to crank. I mean, it was impossible. But it was just because the body was almost too big for the way that the bill angle and all that kind of stuff was. But we're not going to get too deep into that. But there's honorable mention there for the Mann's 20 plus and even the 30 plus as well. But the Hot Lips Express was not as hard to crank as the 30 plus for sure. But it still was a mother, and the body size did not allow this bait to cast really, really far. And one of the interesting things is the man that designed this crankbait, he threw it on a spinning rod. And I thought, no wonder he didn't realize that it doesn't cast all that great, is because he was throwing it on a big spinning rod as he was testing it and designing it. So I thought that was very, very interesting that he was not throwing it on a bait caster, he was throwing it on a spinning rod. That's kind of crazy. But now we're going to get down to the nitty gritty. My opinion, you have to take with a grain of salt, because I've designed one of the ones that I feel like is one of the greatest deep diving crankbaits of all time. One of those other ones I don't have here because it does not cast very well at all, but I think it definitely needs to be mentioned as a Norman DD22. DD22 caught a bunch of fish on that, but man, as far as this whole lineup and all these other crankbaits go, DD22 is one of the worst casting deep diving crankbaits. It would helicopter on you in a second. But the one thing about the DD22 is that the bill angle was down much further, which allowed that bait to come through brush and cover really, really well, because it caused that bait to run a little bit more with the rear of the bait up, kept the hooks away from the cover, and that definitely makes a big difference. And you'll see that here in just a second in another bait. But I've got one that definitely can be in the conversation. And if anybody says that they think this is the best deep diving crankbait of all time, I want to hear your merits, because you probably have some good ones. Is the Strike King 6XD is very good deep diving crankbait. I don't have one. I couldn't find. I looked around in the back and I couldn't find one, but I did find an 8XD, which it's kind of a shed color, it's a good looking color. But this is the 8XD. This is just a slightly larger version. The 6XD is so successful, they ended up doing the 10XD. Phil Marks designed all these crankbaits for Strike King before he passed recently. Very sad, tragic. But his 10XD, he did the 6XD first. Then he went back and did the 5XD. I think he did the 10XD, and then the 8XD, which is this right here, one of his later ones. They all run very good, but the 6XD is kind of like the most popular size, I would say, because I believe that they sold 1 million or 1,012,000 of those. 5XD is very popular size as well, but the 6XD, it just has a little bit of a unique, it's kind of got some bomber characteristics, where it's got a little bit longer body. This, like I said, the 6XD is very similar. It's kind of got that longer, skinny body, but the bill is a little bit modified from the bomber, and all the XD models have that little up kick. It helps get it, add a little extra resistance on the front of the build, help keep that bait going down. I think that little up kick on the bill was genius, because it helped tilt the bait forward. And as you can see, this and this, in the DT16, the Post 400, the bill angle comes out very flat. And what that does is it normally causes the bait to run, about yay in the water, which is a very kind of a natural looking, but with the hooks hanging not much further, about the same distance down as the bill, doesn't give you a lot of clearance when you're hitting brush and cover and things like that. So that little up kick just slightly gets the back of that bait up, 5, 6, 8, 10, all those XD models, kind of kicks them up a little bit and gets them, gets those hooks away from the cover just a little bit. And plus it's got, some loud rattles in it. Some of them, they have silent versions and things now from the popularity. And of course, KVD has caught 1 million in bass, and he's won multiple tournaments, not just one or two. He's won multiple tournaments on the 6XD and the others. Keith Combs just, you know, he combines them anytime that they're on deep structure with the 6XD especially. So definitely an honorable mention. But for my money, you know, I'm completely and totally biased, is the SPRO Little John DD70. Now, DD is obviously a deep diver, but this is a flat-sided crankbait, much similar to the somewhat flat sides of the Bomber that I used to throw a lot. Plus, if you look at the bill angle, it angles down just a little bit more than, say, all the rest of them. Definitely, they're a little bit flatter. And then the bill shape is totally unique. And the other thing that I changed up was the distance that the line tie was from the body. I changed that up because I wanted the front of the bait to kick out more. So many of these other baits, like the DT16, 6XD, even all those, what they do is that when you're reeling it, try to pull the little split ring out here, is that when you're reeling it, it wobbles, the whole bait wobbles around the pivot point of the line tie. So that generates a certain type of vibration so that the bait wiggles back and forth. And by and large, the pivot point is the line tie on, you know, these, basically most of the other ones. Hot Lip's a little different, but most of the other ones, that's how it works. With the Little John, the pivot point is further back. The pivot point is somewhere around the nose of the bait. So what happens is this line tie, actually, if you watch it comes through the water, the line actually goes back and forth. And that does a couple things. It helps the bait come through cover better. Now it's tilted down just a little bit, so when this bait runs, it's running at about this angle right here, which really gets those hooks away from the cover. The wider bill really helps deflect cover as well. And then the other part that we added on here, and the other part is that that line tie kind of bounces back and forth as you're reeling that bait. So that really helps keep this clean. It helps shake off any type of little leaf or any type of stick that it might be coming across or hitting. It really helps get that stuff off as you're reeling it. Plus, it's got a soft tungsten weight transfer system in it. None of the other crankbaits that I mentioned, none of them have a weight transfer system. None of them. I mean, they're all big, and for the most part, most of them cast decent. You know, the Hot Lips, not so much. DD22, not so much. But with this bait being flat-sided, I wanted, you know, it's got a smaller air chamber. Like the amount of air inside of there is smaller. So there's not going to be as much weight added to it. But this bait also has a slow float, which, you know, the suspending model of the Bomber, it was a slow floater. And that's one of the things I loved about that suspending model. The Pose, that's one of the reasons, even the regular Pose 400, David Fritz and a number of those original cranker guys were adding even more weight to the Pose 400 so that they would slowly suspend or suspend. Pose even came out with the suspending versions of the Pose 400 for a little short time. I've got a couple of those as well. But they would slowly float, and that would actually get the bait deeper. If you have a weighted one versus a non-weighted one, you're talking at least another foot, probably 2 feet on average, deeper by that bait slowly floating up versus floating up really fast. And, you know, the ones that float up fast come through cover better, but they're not going to get as deep. So it's kind of a trade-off. So that's what I wanted with the Little John DD, is that I wanted that bait to have that downward tilt, keep the hooks away. I want that slow float. And one of the other really, really cool things about the Little John DD is that when you're reeling it and you stop reeling it, if you stop it really suddenly and give the bait slack, you know, all you big swim bait guys, you know what I'm talking about. It's about giving it slack. When you stop those big swim baits and you need to give it a little slack, like a glide bait or you know, any kind of, even a triple jointed bait. If you're reeling that bait and it's coming along and then you stop it and give it some slack, that bait it'll do a 180 and turn around. The Little John DD does the same thing. It'll stop, and when you give it some slack, it'll actually turn, because as I was mentioning earlier, the pivot point is back here. I think that's one of the reasons that it does that, is that it's hunting left, right, left, right, left, right, And when you give it some slack, it's going to go one way or the other and then just keep going and do a 180. I've caught a ton of bass on that bait when I'm reeling, and maybe I hit cover and then I'll stop it and just give it a little bit of slack. Give it a little bit of slack, that bait will spin, and then all of a sudden, it's like a worm bite. Donk! You reel up, got him. Got him. But you know, most of the time, you could just be burning this thing and they will absolutely house it. So that's definitely my call, mainly because I designed the whole thing start to finish, but it also comes with Gamakatsu treble hooks. I mean, you break them out of the package, make sure they're tuned correctly, and I don't care what bait you're buying, 6XDs, DT16s, any deep diving crankbait, you've got to make sure it is tuned. SPRO Little John DDs the same way. You got to make sure it's tuned. If it is not tuned, if it's slightly out, if it's going, let's say you're reeling it back to you and it's kicking off to the left, you know, you're going to just take that line tie with the split ring is connected to, that line tie, and bend it the opposite direction ever so slightly. I'm talking ever so slightly. You'd rather bend it too little than too much, because you don't want that thing to get all wobbly, the line tie, until it comes back to square. If you have one that's a little bit squirrely, I've told a number of people you can take you can see this one's been just completely gnawed down from crushing a ton of rocks. But you can take a file and just file that leading edge just a little bit to help get that bait kind of zeroed in a little bit. And you can, that holds true for any deep diving crankbait, not just the Little John DD, but any of them. As you're getting them dialed in tune wise, when you get them really close, sometimes you can hit that leading edge. Sometimes you can hit it a little bit more on one side or the other to kind of straighten it up. One of the lure designers that I met from from Pradco back in the day. Old time lure designer, Cliff, actually. He told me he does not touch the line tie. He only tunes crankbaits by shaving that lip. And that's kind of where I got that from, is he shaves that lip on one side or the other to make that bait straighten up. Now, I think that there are times that you can look at that line tie and see that it's bent a little bit one way or the other. That's just maybe the way it came from the factory. It might be bent a little bit to the left or the right. Now, if you bend it up and you kind of bend it about as far as you think you should, and it's still off a little bit, then I think you can go to hitting the sides or the leading edge, and it just takes a little bit of it off. I don't completely understand the aqua dynamics of why that works, but the Little John DD, that's my choice right there for the best deep diving crankbait of all time. And if Kevin Van Dam says it's a 6XD, I can't say that he's not right, but it's only because I promise you he hadn't thrown the Little John DD, and I'm really glad he did not when I fished against him, because if he did, he would probably have won even more money and caught even more. So I'm glad he did not. I'm glad he was throwing the 6XD, but it is very good, very different vibration. You know, if you're fishing team tournaments, you look at combinations of these crankbaits. You know, maybe have somebody be throwing the SPRO Little John, and then your partner's throwing the 6XD, or you're throwing the the Pose 400, and they're throwing the DT16. Give them different vibrations. Give them different looks. If you're out there on these deep spots, hitting those deep brush piles, deep rock piles, deep hard spots, especially on Tennessee River, shale beds, things like that. It can be a lot of fun just to kind of change it up and see what makes those fish down there react, what vibrations do. So if you have a different, I want to hear it. If you have a different deep diving crankbait that you think is the best of all time, drop it down there in the comments. I want to hear what you have to say. And if you disagree with mine, I want to hear it. I want to hear whatever you think the best deep diving crankbait is. Drop it down there in the comments. Let's debate this, folks. Let's debate it. Let's talk about it.